Evening, everyone. It's good to see everybody. I just really encouraged. Evening commitments. I say this from time to time. Evening commitments are not easy. There's lots of other things that you could be doing, and so I'm super appreciative of Alcuin and opportunities that Dan has provided me. I feel healthier spiritually, emotionally when I'm engaged and preparing to teach, and when I'm have opportunities to try to be creative. And the fact that a few people come out and are willing to be engaged with me is greatly encouraging. So it's great to see everybody tonight. We are in the third of 6 weeks on this study of the wisdom literature of the Bible. We're in Proverbs right now. We're going to stay in Proverbs all of tonight, maybe even carry over a little bit into Proverbs still for week 4. And then that'll give us a couple weeks to look at Job and Ecclesiastes as well. But just by way of review, and then I'll pray for us, and then we'll get into new content. Does everybody have a Bible tonight, by the way, just by chance? Okay. If you don't have one on your phone or a hard copy, I think we've got some around here. Yeah, thanks, Eddie. Dan just stepped out for a second, but we'll make sure Dan can make sure everybody gets one. Unless Eddie sees them all right there. But last week, the last thing that we looked at before we moved into the book of Proverbs, more in a concentrated way, was looking at the wisdom literature as a whole. Looked at some of the things that it stresses, if you remember that. I mentioned 4 things. The wisdom literature tends to stress the individual and the universal more than the corporate or collective and national. There's not really a lot about Israel specifically. It's much more universal than that, universally appealing than that. It tends to stress creation over the progress of redemptive history, what God has woven into creation over what God is doing to redeem the world. That's not to say there's nothing of that in there, but the stress is on creation. It tends to stress moral order specifically, but order generally, and moral order quite specifically, and it tends to stress this present age more than the age to come. So those are just the qualities of wisdom literature. And so, if you're reading along in the Old Testament and there's just, a lot of stories, a lot of history, a lot of names, a lot of developments, and then you hit the wisdom literature, it's like, oh, this feels a little bit different. Yeah, it's quite different. There's not much of a narrative. Now, obviously, there's a narrative in Job, but it's a story about Job and his suffering more than it's about some kind of progress of God's redemptive plan within the nation of Israel. In fact, when we get to Job, it doesn't seem that Job is a Hebrew name, and the friends that come alongside him don't appear to be Hebrew names either. And so, it's certainly, again, not focusing on national concerns, but much more universal concerns. Job, of course, the issue of human suffering. So I wanted to review those 4 things before getting us back into the book of Proverbs. And I don't think we'll get all the way through Proverbs tonight. We'll see. There's some things I want to do. But I do want to open us in prayer. So let's do that. Our God in heaven, we thank you for the opportunity to be together tonight. Again, there's lots to do in life, and we have to make a lot of decisions, and there's commitments that are calling for our time, and I just thank you for these individuals who have come out tonight, and I pray that our time together would enrich our lives and enrich our faith, and that we would leave this place having been nourished and nurtured, and we would connect relationally with you and with one another, and that we would be the wiser for spending time reflecting upon your word. So we pray for your Spirit to bless our time together tonight. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. So I did want to cover one last thing, because we were late last week jumping over this. And that is some of these aspects of the way the Proverbs are structured, I guess you could say, poetically. And so these last 4 things here, I just went through them. We didn't look them up. So the Proverbs, unlike a lot of English proverbs, consist of 2 lines. Sometimes more than that. Sometimes, you can see here, sometimes 4. sometimes 6, sometimes 8, but most of them they're called couplets. And that's the way Hebrew proverbs typically work. And so there's 2 lines, and the way that these 2 poetic lines relate to each other vary a little bit. So you have synonymous kinds of pairings, antithetical, synthetic, and comparative. And so I want to just look at these so you kind of get a sense of what these sound like and what they look like. So chapter, in 16:8 of Proverbs, you have an example of synonymous coupling. So the lines, the 2 lines of the proverb are synonymous. It's basically restating the same thing. 16:18 said, I think I maybe mentioned this one last week. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And so you notice how synonymous, that the pairing is synonymous. Pride paired with a haughty spirit, destruction, and a fall. Just slightly.
So great that we say pride goes before a fall.
Right, there you go. And if somebody, corrects you on it because they know their Bible well, say, well, that's synonymous parallelism though, right? So you can go ahead and say pride. You can go ahead and say pride goes before a fall. That's not untrue either because of the synonymous nature of the proverb. But you have antithetical ones as well. Go back to 11:17. This is the opposite kind of the synonymous parallelism. A man who is kind benefits himself, but a cruel man hurts himself. You see how it's not saying the same thing, it's saying this, and the opposite of that is true. So that's an example of antithetical. Synthetic, you kind of get some development from the first line to the second line. There's kind of a development in it. For example, chapter 10, verse 18. Now let's think about how these 2 are relating to each other, these 2 lines. The one who conceals hatred has lying lips, and whoever utters slander is a fool. Now, would you say those are synonymous? Not exactly. Are they antithetical? Definitely not. There's just kind of some development in there. Are they related? They're related, kind of in a developmental, much looser way. The one who conceals hatred has lying lips, and whoever utters slander is a fool. Both related to speech, both cast in more of a negative kind of tone, things you want to avoid. But you can call this a number of things. I think it's C. Hassel Bullock in his book on the wisdom literature in the Bible calls it a synthetic relationship. And then you have sometimes comparative as well. These are pretty easy to identify because it has the word like in them often. This is like that. Comparative, example of that is 25:25. Like cold water to a thirsty soul, so is good news from a far country. Good news from a far country is like this. It's a comparative relationship between the 2 lines of the proverb. So, again, rushed over that last week, but as you read through much of the Proverbs, and again, the first 9 chapters of Proverbs are not like couplets. They're more extended discourses. So once you get to chapter 10, you'll see this pairing often. Again, sometimes it's more than 2 lines. It's sometimes 4, sometimes 6, sometimes 8, but typically they're 2 lines. And those 2 lines can relate to each other in a number of ways from a literary perspective. So I just wanted to kind of give you a sense of that. Okay, so moving on then, we were ready to tackle the nature of Proverbs. So all that was under the structure of the Proverbs. So we looked at an outline of the book of Proverbs. And now we want to look at the nature of these Proverbs as they are in the Bible. And then to conclude, we'll look at some truths of Proverbs. So what are we supposed to take away from some of these Proverbs? But first, the nature of Proverbs. So the book of Proverbs is a collection of generalized truths. These things are typically true, about life and the way that the world works. The Proverbs are making certain claims about order again, and specifically moral order. And this moral order is observable in the world. In fact, it's so discernible if you stop and look and listen and pay attention that only a fool would fail to detect such an order. So that idea of generalized truths is really important when we think about the Proverbs. Now, I have more to say about that as we go along. And of course, the generalized quality of the Proverbs is important to recognize when we get to Job and Ecclesiastes as well. Because could we say, well, doesn't Job contradict what the Proverbs teach? No, I wouldn't use the word contradiction. It adds to how we understand wisdom, as well as Ecclesiastes. Second thing, because Proverbs are generalized observations of life truths, our world works like this, Proverbs should not be read as if they were promises. Proverbs are not promises. They're observations about the way life works in a generalized way. If you remain active, you'll be the healthier for it. Is that true? Mm-hmm. Right, good, Roger. In general, yes. Is that a promise? Did I even cast it as a promise in stating it? No. The Proverbs aren't communicating promises either. They're making statements that are generally true. And we would recognize that that's true. So if you find somebody that's an exception to that, would you say, well, obviously, that's not true then? It's not true that if you stay active, you'll generally be healthy. No, it's still true. It's just there are exceptions to that.
I'm counting on being exceptional.
Right, yeah, well, there really are exceptions to that, though. We'll talk about maybe some more of those in a second. But I listed Proverbs 22:6 here because sometimes we can be prone to read that as if it's a promise. But it's not a promise. It's just kind of the way things generally work. 22:6 is train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. So God has given us a promise that if we teach our children scriptural truths when they're old, they'll be saved. They'll make a profession of faith. That's not what Proverbs 22:6 says. That's not what it's trying to communicate. We could ask the question, well, what is it trying to communicate? But we're going to do a whole exercise here where we look at a number of Proverbs. Like, okay, so what's the principle behind that? It's not a promise. It's a general principle of the way life works. That's what all the Proverbs are. There's no promises. Maybe I shouldn't be quite so dogmatic without scouring it to see if there's promises in here. There may be some promises in it, but the wisdom of Proverbs is not primarily, or generally speaking, to carry out the generalization aspect of that, interested in communicating divine promises. It's just not what wisdom literature is doing. It's communicating about, this is the way the world works. So that's important, not to read Proverbs as if they're promises. And not just that one, but any of them. Pride goes before destruction. Is that a promise? It's an observation about the way the world works. Third thing, the Proverbs deal with norms and not exceptions, but there are exceptions. Now, we're going to obviously get into this reality of exceptions because we have to when we get to Job and Ecclesiastes. But Proverbs 10:4. This is right at the beginning of the kind of proverbial section of the book. Remember, chapters 1 through 9 have longer discourses, extended sayings and treatments of things. Chapter 10 starts with the kind of proverbial sayings. 10:4 is, a slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. That's the ESV translation.
That's before the IRS.
So there's a number of things that could bear upon that, where that might not be the case. There are people with slack hands who are not just not poor, they might actually be wealthy. but not because of anything that they've done. They just, life circumstances have enabled them to possess wealth and riches without actually having to do anything for those things. In the hand of the diligent, people can be extremely diligent and not necessarily have riches for a number of reasons. There are exceptions. Again, that's not a promise. If I work diligently, I will become rich. God's word promises me that. No, it doesn't. It's not how to read that proverb or any of the proverbs. I've got some other examples on here, right? So some of you that enjoy sports, I mean, this is true most of the time. If you lose the turnover battle in a football game, in other words, you've turned the ball over more than your opponent has, you can go up and statistically look at the, I didn't look it up on the internet, but the statistics are probably quite high. And the more turnovers you have in your opponent, the more likely it is that you didn't win that game. If you lose the turnover battle, you're going to lose the game, generally speaking. But I think I saw a game last weekend where a team had more turnovers than their opponent, and they won. Doesn't always happen that way. Generally speaking, if you are a recovering addict of anything, your chances of actually overcoming that addiction in isolation from a supportive community is extremely low. It just so low that people who try to help addicts deal with their addiction will insist that they become part of a community. Because if you're trying to do that alone, you're not going to be able to beat it. So you have to get connected to people. Now, has it ever happened where someone has overcome some kind of addiction without a strong supportive community? Yeah, but that's exceptional. That's not the rule. Generally, you're just not going to be able to do that. You need a supportive community. And not just for addictions, but a number of other things as well. I think most significant life changes require a supportive community. I read a book not too long ago. It's called Changing for Good. I think some of you maybe, I've mentioned this in your presence before. It's called Changing for Good. It's written by some physicians about what their research shows allows people to who are after change. And a lot of those were health-related changes. I think they did a lot of their research on people who were trying to lose weight, trying to begin exercising, trying to stop smoking, and there's one other one in there. And one of the things that their research showed consistently on all of those things is that the likelihood of actually attempting to change and then being successful in that change was being surrounded by a supportive group of people. Critical for all of them. So it's not just addictions, but we need people around us that can support and encourage us, or it's hard to make significant changes in life for the better. Is it possible to do it? Yeah, but it's a very rare situation in which it happens. And Proverbs is not dealing with the rare situations. That's the point here. Proverbs doesn't say there's no exceptions to any of these things. It's just saying, generally speaking, this is the way the world works. The wisdom in the Proverbs is asserted as time-tested truth. We think about how often, particularly in the early chapters of the book with the longer discourses, my son listened to me. Now, why is the father speaking to the son, or the teacher speaking to the student? The son could be a student as well. Why is the father so insistent in appealing to the son to follow this path and not that path? Well, because that path is a proven path. That there's experience that supports that these kinds of decisions lead to this, and these kinds of decisions lead to that. It's not just this is one isolated kind of experience. It's more of a collective experience. It's a time-tested truth. And it shouldn't be ignored because it's got the weight of time behind it. There's generations that would support that this is how the world works. So don't learn everything the hard way. Listen to some instruction for people who have gone before you and gone through some of these things before. It can be trusted because it's old. And I just noted here that it's almost, that's the opposite concept today. That, well, if it's old, that's why it should be discounted. You know, why would you listen to this, this dusty old, anything in this dusty old book? Why would you take that to be true?
Okay, boomer.
It's like, well, it's been around for a really long time. So that might actually be an argument in its favor.
Yeah.
If it was worthless and didn't say anything of human significance, probably wouldn't be hearing about it. But it's different today. So when we think about time-tested experience and things that have been around a while, I read Jordan Peterson's Rules for Life books. I read the first one and the second one. I generally hesitate to bring up Jordan Peterson in public contexts because he can be polarizing. But I'm not really sure why Jordan Peterson is so polarizing, to be honest with you. I understand why other political pundits are polarizing, and I kind of get why Peterson, and particularly maybe more recently, gets put into that same kind of category. But from reading Jordan Peterson's books, he doesn't strike me as someone who's writing from primarily a political perspective, or even within a political agenda. He writes as a psychological clinician, and that's why his books read. I find his psychological insights very helpful, most of the time true. I find his social critique quite helpful and insightful as well. Not always right, but insightful, worth thinking about, and thoughtful. But I guess when you're a pretty strong critic of certain forms of feminism, very vocal opponent of transgender ideology, someone who goes on record questioning the existence of a gender pay gap, you're probably going to get cast as a far right-wing kind of conservative. But here's what Peterson writes that I found insightful about some of these time-tested truths, thinking about time-tested truth. So I think I've got one from his first 12 Rules for Life book, and then another one from the book. What's the second one called?
12 More Truths?
Yeah, 12 More Rules for Life, Beyond Chaos, or Beyond Order is the second one. First one is called An Antidote to Chaos. The second one is called Beyond Order. But Peterson writes this. He says, there's no shortage of wisdom and guidance outside of us, embedded in the social world. No shortage of wisdom that's out there. Why rely on our own limited resources to remember the road or to orient ourselves in new territory when we can rely on signs and guideposts placed there so effortfully by others? It's interesting there. He doesn't say effortlessly. People have labored hard to kind of figure out ways of living in the world that lead to blessing and flourishing, that have worked. Don't ignore that. Pay attention to that. You don't have to figure out everything. You're only here for 70, 80, 90 years, tops. That's if you're blessed with longevity. You're not going to be able to just start from scratch and figure everything out on your own. People have gone before you and lived through these experiences and have learned some valuable, truthful lessons. Might be worth listening to them instead of just throwing it all off because it's old. And old people don't know what they're talking about, which is,
Sometimes true.
an issue. Yeah, sometimes true. But it's a posture of youth, right? You don't know what you're talking about. So he says this as well, along the same lines. The crowd is by no means always right, but it's commonly right. It's typically right. If you say something that takes everyone aback, therefore, you should reconsider what you said. I say that's what I appreciate about Peterson. He's very measured, very cautious. I say that knowing full well that controversial opinions are sometimes correct, sometimes so much so that the crowd will perish if it refuses to listen. So he recognizes he's not not disputing that. It is for this reason, among others, that the individual is morally obliged to stand up and tell the truth of his or her own experience. But something new and radical is still almost always wrong. Not always wrong, almost always wrong. New and radical, it's almost always wrong. Because people have been living for a long time before you. And so if you're saying, again, something that just takes everyone aback, it's like, yeah, that's not right, you should probably pause before you insist that it is. And he goes on to say, you need good, even great reasons to ignore or defy general public opinion. And you might think, well, that's not true today because of the opinions. But if you think about how many public opinions we just take by some kind of assumption, there's tons of them. And most of those are still correct. That living life in certain ways, because this is kind of the way that we do things, there's so many of those things that still happen every day. It was like, yeah, actually, that's correct. We should do those things. So he says, you need good, even great reasons to ignore or defy general public opinion. That's your culture. It's a mighty oak. You perch on one of its branches. If the branch breaks, it's a long way down, farther perhaps than you think. If you're reading this book, there's a strong probability that you're a privileged person. You can read. You have time to read. You're perched high in the clouds. It took untold generations to get you where you're at. A little gratitude might be in order. So I read that and it's refreshing to me. A little gratitude might be in order. If you're going to insist on bending the world to your way, you better have your reasons. If you're going to stand your ground, you better have your reasons. You better have thought them through. You might otherwise be in for a very hard landing. So I think, to me, that reflects something of the wisdom of Proverbs. That some of the instruction of Proverbs is saying those exact things. Just listen to me, my son. These are time-tested truths. And this is a life that leads to blessing and flourishing. Again, not just in the age to come, but the here and now. A virtuous life, a flourishing life, a life of blessing. This is the way. That way, it's going to lead you in the other direction. Yeah, Dan.
Just reminds me of G.K. Chesterton and his phrase, the democracy of the dead. That we should listen to those who have gone before us.
Oh, yeah.
That they should have a vote in
That's right.
how we live.
Yeah. I think it's John Fea in a history book says something very similar, that reading history is a way that we give those who are no longer with us a continuing voice at the table.
Yeah.
And it's unwise to completely ignore history. It's equally unwise to insist that what has happened in history continue to happen today. Right? Situations change. So that requires wisdom. That's demanding. But anyway, wanted to share that with you. The Proverbs are offered in a compressed form. And what that means is it can be applied to a number of different circumstances, but Proverbs doesn't tell you all of those circumstances in which it might apply. It just takes a principle and it compresses it into 2 lines and says, this is the way the world works. And you're like, okay, let's kind of trace that out. That's why when you're reading the Proverbs, I don't know if this is your experience. It's not as much my experience when I read the first 9 chapters any longer. But I love the book of Proverbs, but when you read a chapter in the Proverbs, and it's like 31 verses, so that's likely 31 Proverbs. I don't know about you, but you close your Bible and you put it down, you're like, okay, what's one thing I can take away from all that? Because there's like 31 Proverbs, just one after the other. It's just a lot. It's a lot to absorb. And the Proverbs, just one proverb demands some sustained reflection to think about, okay, what is this saying? What does it mean? How does it apply? How can I apply it? Where do I not apply this consistently? And where do I need to implement it more faithfully? It's difficult to do that. So part of it is reflecting on what is the principle of the proverb. because the proverb, it is stating a principle, but it's generally stating it within a certain kind of context. Or it, it can't use limitless language. It's a generalized saying, but it has to use specific language. Our own proverbs do this. So think about this. Go back to some of those ones we looked at last week, proverbs in our own language. Look before you leap. Well, there's a principle behind that. And the principle is expressed in this kind of specific context in which jumping is involved. Why use that? Well, because once you jump, you're in. Like, you can't stop in midair. And so, what is the principle the principle of wisdom being communicated with our proverb, look before you leap? Let's just put it in non-proverbial language and expand it a little bit more. Which, of course, that's not a proverb. To spend 4 sentences in explaining a principle, well, that's not a proverb. Part of the genius and beauty of a proverb is it compresses, those 4 sentences that you would generally have to use to state a proverb and how it applies into this thing. Look before you leap. But what's that communicating? What's the principle of wisdom there?
Think about something before you commit to doing it.
Exactly. Think about consequences and potential dangers before you just jump right in and do it. That's the principle. Don't count your chickens before they're hatched. What's the principle?
There are a lot of things that can happen between point A and point B.
Right. A lot of things can happen between point A and point B. And what do you not have yet at point A that you should remember before you make definitive plans that are irreversible to get to point B?
Expected payoff.
Right. You don't have the chickens yet. So don't make those kinds of definitive decisions as if things have happened that haven't yet happened. Now, does that mean you can't anticipate things? Well, no, that's why there's more than one proverb that governs life. But we also recognize that that's a wise saying, because there are times where people do things based on presumption and maybe overstep in terms of commitment with a presumption that this is going to happen. There's no guarantee that that's going to happen. Things have to be nurtured and cared for and prepared for in order for that to happen. So don't approach the situation as if it's already happened, because your chickens haven't hatched yet. So make sure you're still caring for your eggs while you're preparing for these kinds of things, as opposed to just acting like it's already happened. It hasn't. But the Proverbs are the same way. So what I have here is a number of Proverbs. I'm going to give everybody 2 of these, okay? Proverbs oftentimes require extended reflection, so I'm not expecting you to look at it for 5 seconds and, here's the principle. So we're just going to kind of walk through some of these. I think I've got all the ones marked for myself that I passed out. But and if you don't want to read out loud, that's okay too. Just have somebody else next to you read, because I don't know who has what. But would somebody be willing to read Proverbs 13:11?
Is this one of the, should somebody have it?
Yes, somebody should have 13:11. Is that you, Aaron?
Yeah.
Now, is 21:5 on there as well? Okay, so would you go ahead and read both of those, Aaron? And so when Aaron reads those, I'm not going to make Aaron say, okay, well, so what's the principle? But if you have an idea, you can go ahead and share it. But what we want to do is try to identify the basic principle of wisdom that's being communicated in these Proverbs. So go ahead, Aaron.
13:11. Dishonest money dwindles away, but whoever gathers money little by little makes it grow.
Interesting.
What was it? Say again, you're not sure.
Yeah.
The what?
Dishonest money dwindles away, but whoever gathers money little by little makes it grow.
Soonest? Is that what what's the second word there? The what money?
But whoever gathers money little by little.
No, the second word in it. The what money?
Whoever gathers money?
No, the second word in the whole in
Dishonest money?
Soonest?
Dishonest.
Dishonest. I'm sorry. I did not understand there. Sorry.
So what?
Dishonest.
So what is it again, Aaron? What's the reading in
Oh,
your?
that's not at all it. That's
Uh-huh.
interesting.
We will get. That's one of the things. Different translations will yield different
Yeah,
proverbs.
it's very different from
So what was it again, Aaron? How's it start again?
dishonest.
Dishonest?
Little by little.
Yeah.
Well, what happened?
No, that's the second part.
It dwindles away.
Dwindles away.
Dishonest dwindles away little by little. Makes it grow.
Okay.
Yeah, the ESV says wealth gained hastily, not dishonestly.
Right. But I have a number 3 down there. No, I have a 5. Do you guys have a drop down? In your English translation? Do you know what I mean by drop down? There's a little number there.
Okay, or
It
by fraud.
takes you down in the basement. Yeah, we got by fraud. So that gets close to dishonest.
Yeah.
All right, Aaron, 21:5 is related. That's why I included both of those.
It says, the plans of the diligent lead to profit, as surely as haste leads to policy.
Okay. All right. So does everybody have those in their mind?
Yeah.
What's the principle? What would you say? What are those two proverbs communicating?
Slow and sure promises gain, rashness goes
Yes.
to ruin.
Yes, that's right. There's something about sustainability in things that might appear small, but over time is where the payoff is. You try to skip that process, you don't get anything.
It's like investing.
Yeah, it is.
Exactly.
What did you say?
It's like investing. Here's one of the ways I would just summarize it. Trust the process. Have you heard that phrase? Just trust the process. Do the little things over and over again. Be faithful with those things, and it will yield increase. Now, of course, the reason that needs to be a proverb is, will you see that immediately? No. Think about how many things are that way. Well, I tried to learn guitar. Oh, really? How long did you practice? About 4 months. But I just didn't get it, so I quit. You gotta stick with that a little bit longer. You can't learn to play an instrument really, really well in a short amount of time. It's impossible. Unless you've already learned to play an instrument and then go to a related instrument. Maybe that's a quicker process. But I mean, if you're trying to learn an instrument for the first time, I mean, there's no quick way to do that. So any other thoughts on that one?
It's kind of like gambling and investing.
Yeah.
And trying to get your money too quickly by gambling. It's not
Exactly.
gonna work
Yeah,
out.
that's the other side of it.
But
That's
if you
right.
save all that money you spent gambling, it'll pay off in the long run.
Yeah, so interesting. I didn't think about this, and I don't know how related this is, but we have an English proverb that gets close to that, particularly when it comes to money.
Penny saved a penny.
That's it. That's what I was thinking of. Penny saved is a penny earned. I never understood that as a kid. It's like, what does that mean? Penny saved is a penny earned. Anyway, all right. So 14. Does somebody have that actually?
I did,
Okay, now Nina, does that have 19, 23, and 35 on it too?
yes.
Okay, so Nina's got 4 proverbs, all in chapter 14. Do you mind reading those, Nina?
Not at all.
Okay.
14:14, the backslider in heart will be filled with the fruit of his ways, and a good man will be filled with the fruit of his ways.
So not antithetical, right? Antithetical proverb. Okay, 19.
The evil bow down before the good, the wicked at the gates of the righteous.
And there's 23.
inclines only to poverty.
All right, and then the last one is 35.
A servant who deals wisely has the king's favor, but his wrath falls on one who acts shamefully.
Okay, I know that's a lot to take in there. The key one is 14:14. I could have just stopped with verse 14. And the ESV translation, that's what you read out of too, isn't it, Nina?
Yes.
The backslider in heart will be filled with the fruit of his ways. A good man will be filled with the fruit of his ways. And I would detect something similar in those other verses, and actually more in that chapter than just that one. So what is the what's the principle?
You'll end up getting what you got coming to you.
Exactly.
To answer with another proverb, you reap what you sow.
That's it. That's it. That's huge in Proverbs. I mean, in fact, I would, and we'll get there probably next week. The moral order that Proverbs is wanting to communicate is precisely that reality. What you're sowing, you will reap. So notice again verse 35. A servant who deals wisely. Okay, that's a sowing. What's reaped from that? The king's favor. But the king's wrath falls on one who acts shamefully. There's a sowing and reaping in that. Same thing with the one about the gates, right? In verse 19, the evil bow down before the good, the wicked at the gates of the righteous. That's going to be determined by decisions that people make in life, whether they're good or righteous. And in the end, the one who sows to righteousness, if you will be the one to whom those who sow in, what's the exact language there? Evil will bow before. So, yeah, sowing and reaping very clearly in there. How about chapter 14, verse 2? Who's got that one? John.
Whosoever walks in uprightness fears the Lord, but he who is devious in his ways despises him.
Oh, this is so interesting. Whoever walks in uprightness fears the Lord. Sometimes the Proverbs are this way, right? Sometimes it just sounds like they're stating the obvious. Whoever walks in uprightness fears the Lord, and whoever fears the Lord walks in uprightness. Yeah, there's a strong connection there. But he who is devious in his ways despises him. What might be one of the principles there? Particularly think of the order of the proverb, and I'd have to look in Hebrew to see if much could be made about the order. But notice, whoever walks in uprightness fears the Lord. It doesn't say it the other way. And that may be more important in the second half of it. But he who is devious in his ways despises him. What might be something that the proverb is getting at there? And we do see this, by the way, in people.
Is it that your actions are a reflection of your status with the Lord, or is it vice versa?
Right. What is the vice versa of that? Your actions are a reflection, or
Fear of.
what's that?
Fear of the Lord.
Yeah. Or your actions are a shaper of your status before the Lord. Does that make sense what I'm saying? In other words, I think part of what this proverb is getting at is that if you're devious in your ways, you will come to despise the Lord. It's not just that if you despise the Lord, you will sin. It's also true that if you commit to a path of sin, you will begin to despise the Lord more and more. Does that make sense? Those are not quite the same things. Some people have committed to a particular way of living. And as a result of that commitment, they grow in their opposition and rebellion to the Lord. We see that. I'm convinced that we see. In fact, we may see that more often than we realize. Most people's objections to Christian faith, I believe, are not intellectual. They're moral, and they're not, well, Christianity is immoral. It's, I prefer my immorality, and therefore I will rail against your whole system. That's not to say there are not intellectual difficulties. I just, at the end of the day, I don't think that the most powerful objections that people have to Christianity are intellectual ones. There's been people dealing with the intellectual challenges of Christianity for a really long time and have offered some suitable answers. It's a moral problem. So I think this proverb touches on that a little bit.
It seems like a litmus test to, when I read, I think, whoever walks in uprightness fears the Lord.
Hmm.
Okay, I think I fear the Lord.
Yeah, do you walk in
But
uprightness?
I'm walking in uprightness.
That's
Okay,
true
that's a
too.
test, right? He was devious. Am I ever devious? Oh, I better be careful there.
Yeah.
Sometimes I am.
Yeah.
I think I love the Lord, but
Yeah.
when I'm, there seems to be a testing.
I think
or
so.
something there.
Yeah. I think that's very true. The curious thing about that is, again, the ordering of,
Yeah.
of the language here.
Yeah.
That the testing part would be equally as true if it just said, he who fears the Lord walks in uprightness. Okay, then do I fear the Lord? Do I walk in uprightness?
Right. Right.
Or I think there's something about this, he who is devious in his ways despises him. Because you're devious in your ways,
Yeah.
you despise the Lord. Yeah, John?
Obedience and disobedience. It's like obeying the Lord and then the disobeying is just getting into sin.
Yeah, think about this in connection with what we're talking about. They loved the darkness more than the light because of their, how does that, I thought it was in John 1:1.
John 3:19.
3:19, thank you, Chase.
Yeah.
Then I started thinking, and maybe it was as a conversation with Nicodemus, but I knew I wasn't going to be able to find that in time. Thank you. 3:19. Yeah, listen to this. And this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people love the darkness rather than the light because their deeds were evil.
Yeah.
Did you hear that? Why did they love darkness? Because their deeds were already evil. And I think there's something about the proverb that's touching on that a little bit, if that makes sense. How about 16:21?
That's mine too.
Jackpot.
The wise of heart is called discerning, and sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness.
Ah,
These two don't seem to have much to do with each other. Is it synthetic? A little.
probably. The wise of heart is called discerning, and sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness. So yeah, that's why, again, the Proverbs often demand extended reflection. Why are these two paired together? Why is this the proverb? And what's the principle? Well, I think one basic principle, particularly of the second half of it, is somewhat straightforward. Why is sweetness of speech persuasive? Or why does it increase persuasiveness?
Because it can be heard.
Right. It can be heard. And why can it be heard more readily than, say, a non-persuasive word? And why is that?
I think you were talking about Peterson earlier, and my thought about Peterson is his delivery.
Ah,
Many times his delivery is not sweet.
ah,
It's very in your face.
uh-huh.
And it doesn't go down well, even though it might be the truth.
Yeah. So, what we all readily acknowledge all the time is that it's not just what you say, it's how you say it. And this is only one of many proverbs that touches on this
And
very
often
thing.
It's more, that is more.
That's, you could say the most beautiful string of 10 words to your loved one that have ever been uttered. And you could say it in such a tone that it would be completely and utterly rejected.
What is that verse, let your speech be?
Seasoned with salt,
Yeah.
gracious.
Yeah.
That's right. Always be ready to have an answer for anyone who asks for the hope that is within you. But do this with gentleness and respect. How you say it matters. And so that's wisdom, right? We would want anybody that we're training up to live well in the world, if this is how the world works, listen. Don't just think about what you're going to say and insisting that you're only going to speak the truth. You also have to think about how you're going to say it. A gentle answer turns away wrath. That's another proverb, but getting to the same kind of principle. You can avoid a certain kind of reaction from someone you're talking, which is exactly your point, Jackie, right? That you can gain an audience or lose an audience, not just with the content of your speech, but the manner of your speech. That's wisdom. Acknowledging that, accepting that. That's the way the world works. That's the way relationships work.
So is the first part then, if you're wise, you will understand?
I think so. I think that's the connection. That there's discernment that plays into that. What will Nina find persuasive in both the content and manner of my speech? And let me employ that discerningly. That takes wisdom.
It seems like several of these in this chapter are building off of each other or playing off each other. When I read 23 there, the heart of the wise makes his speech judicious and adds persuasiveness to his lips.
Mm-hmm.
It's parallel to the one we just read, but it spells out the connection more clearly.
What verse is that, Dan?
That's 23.
24 is just like it. It says, pleasant words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul,
Yeah.
and healing to the bones.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, we get similar or parallel kinds of proverbial statements of wisdom in the collection. It's not just stated one time, one way, which itself might be wise. Right? You get to turn that a little bit, same thing, same principle, but you turn it around and the light hits it a little bit differently. You see it from different perspectives. Were you going to say something, Jane? Yeah.
I have not read The Art of War by Sun Tzu, but somehow that makes me think of something that he might have said. Is that true or not? Because I assume you've probably read it and thought about it.
I have not read it, actually. What sounds like something he might have said?
The way you say what you say helps
sure.
get it through.
I would say this, and this goes back to like this universal kind of thing and other ancient Near East peoples having similar kinds of proverbs. How to say this? Wisdom at any time and in any place would affirm what we're talking about. It matters how you say things.
Just think of the different ways you react to someone who
Totally.
demands something from you,
Correct.
as opposed to someone who begs for something from you.
Right. We all, again, the experiential depths of the Psalms. That's why it's so appealing. It's like, yeah, it resonates with all of us, universally, Christian or non-Christian. Non-Christians know every bit as much as Christians the wisdom of how you say something matters as much as what you're actually saying. There's, I've watched some, I don't want to put Mike on the spot here, but I know, I'm assuming you have to think through de-escalating situations, right? That's all about, maybe not all about, but a lot of that has to do with how you say things, how you approach it, the manner that you're dealing with somebody who's upset or is bordering on violence. I've watched some videos on de-escalating. It's quite fascinating. But you can add gasoline to that if you approach it the wrong way, take the wrong tone, say something the wrong way, or you can diffuse it by handling it with wisdom. So we all know that that's true. Right here it is. But we need to be reminded of that sometimes, because here's the amazing thing. We all know it's true, and we all mess up in ways with embarrassing frequency. Yeah, that would have been way better if I just said it like that. But I was angry at the time. So I said it when I was angry. And so then the Proverbs say, well, let me tell you something about the importance of self-control and handling anger. So it's wonderful. Proverbs are so great. And we won't have time to go through all of these. So you may have some Proverbs in your hand, but we won't be able to get to them. I wish we could get to all of them. Let's do this. 17:1. Who's got 17:1? Okay.
It says, better a dry crust with peace and quiet than a house full of feasting and strife.
That's okay. Read that one more time, Mike.
Better a dry crust with peace and quiet than a house full of feasting and strife.
Okay. What's the principle? Take it out of its proverbial garb, which is so well stated. And just, what's the principle? Take the poetry out of it and just say, well, it's this. This is the truth of it.
It elevates peace over
Well,
things.
Right. What kind of peace specifically?
It's peace of life,
Right?
Family.
family.
Relational harmony is more important than material gain. I mean, just think about the wisdom of that. So, my son, what are you going after most? Material gain? Will you sacrifice relational harmony for the sake of pursuing material gain? If you do that, you're foolish. Because you may have all of this material wealth and all your relationships are filled with strife. That's not a way to live. That's not a way to flourish. You won't even experience flourishing or blessing. So that's the principle. And again, the proverb doesn't say you can't have both. It just says better is this than this. If you're only going to have one, relational harmony is the way to go.
And isn't it, this is a trope in so much literature and film. You see a poor family that loves one another, and then the rich family that's always backbiting.
That's right.
Even I think the Little House on the Prairie.
That's right.
What was her name? Who is the?
That's so great. Yeah, that's right.
But that's everywhere, right? In
everywhere.
Literature and in film.
That's really insightful. That's right. So this is what's so great about Proverbs, right? They're compressed, but we could take the week to think about 17:1 and think about how it applies to our own lives, how we see it culturally affirmed, how we see it experientially confirmed in those around us, and all come back and all have really rich, engaging stories and examples of why this is so wise.
Yeah.
This is how much this actually says about how to live a life in the sphere of blessing. It's filled with these. This is one proverb of a very large book of Proverbs. I'm trying to think of some other ones that I don't want to skip. Well, here's one I like. So there's a group that meets at New Life called Healthy Life, and they talk a lot about the connections between body and soul and things of that nature, and taking care of both. But here's a proverb. If you look at 17:22, I would suggest that this is a proverb that at least implies a connection between emotional and spiritual health and physical well-being. A joyful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. It's interesting there. I don't think you can spiritualize bones there. I think it's referring to something quite physical. But what is it that's drying up the bones? A crushed spirit. It's not a bad body. It's not physical illness that's drying up the bones. It's a crushed spirit that will do that. And we all know that's true. Talk to somebody that's experiencing depression or acute anxiety. That's not something that's just affecting their mind or their spirit. That's bodily too, because that's how we're made. God integrated us as
Jane,
body and
consider
soul.
the 2 chapters from the Scarlet Letter that we
Yeah.
read.
Oh, interesting. See, it's said again.
Yeah.
I just love how there's connections that pop up in people's minds. What else? Let's look at 20. Who's got 20 verse 30?
I do,
Who was that, Chris or is this Chris?
yeah.
Will you read that?
Sure. Blows that wound cleanse away evil. Strokes make clean the innermost parts.
Wow. Yeah, right. Blows that wound cleanse away evil. Strokes make clean the innermost parts. What's the principle there?
Tough love.
Yeah, tough love is something to be commended, because maybe we say this too, Nina. It's something to be commended because there's a true principle in tough love, and it's the same principle, I think. This is a harder one. That's why I wanted to kind of stop on this. What is
I thought
what
about
is this getting at?
conscience, too.
What's that?
Conscience, your conscience, blows that wound.
Okay, yeah,
If you feel wound,
yeah,
cleansing away evil,
Yeah.
I think conscience is a
that's right.
good thing.
That's right. But it's a, and I agree with what you're saying, Chris. But specifically, it's a stricken conscience.
Yeah.
And so a stricken conscience brings with it a certain measure of emotional or mental anguish or pain. And so what's one of the things that pain can effect?
A change in behavior.
For the better or for the worse?
Both.
Right. But in the proverb,
For the both.
in the proverb, for the better. In fact, it can cleanse. Both lines actually in the English translation have words cleansing. How about this? Pain can be a purifier, which is why tough love.
Yeah, but it can also, what was the previous one, crush the spirit,
But that's right.
if it's not handled the right way.
That's correct. It depends on the situation, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So think about this. Does the sun melt things or does it harden things? Isn't that interesting? That depends on the material it's dealing with. So pain can be a purifier. Pain can crush the bones, crush the spirit. Or you crush the bones, I guess.
But the connection between the spirit and the physical is in both. And I think of James when he says, is any of you sick? He should confess his sins to the elders,
That's right.
right? And he will be healed.
Yeah.
There's a
Forgiven. I think it's the language
Yeah.
that James uses, actually. Yeah.
I
Yes, sir.
think there's also a link to Isaiah 53. Kind of a typological, but he was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Those blows that wounded Christ cleansed away our.
Yeah, that's right.
Beautiful.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so. Yeah, if you lift that principle up into kind of a transcendent theology, pain can purify. You're left with amen to that.
Yeah.
Because that's our purification has come, but not ultimately through pain that's been inflicted upon us, but pain that's been inflicted upon our Savior. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, John, you have a comment?
When growing up, my dad would say, "This is gonna hurt me more than." I would look at him like, "How's that? When you're getting a spanking here,
Yeah,
for being, out of line.
yeah,
How's this gonna hurt me more, right? And
right.
hurt him more."
Yeah, that's right. We don't have time for too many more.
Is that, I was looking it up, is that why the Catholics, some of them would strike their back with, I forget what kind of instrument is called to punish themselves for their sins as a form of pain to, I mean, is it taken from that, or is that, what's that from?
Yeah, that's a good question. Just very briefly, I'll say it's taken from a notion that penance is a kind of action that is still required for full atonement. And so oftentimes that's kind of going through the steps of proper penance, showing enough sorrow for sin so that those sins can be blotted out. But you have to do something for those. The sacrifice of Christ alone is not sufficient for your full atonement. So there's, I mean, that's still part of it, right? I mean, you go to confession, Father, forgive me for I've sinned. What do I have to do? Well, you have to do this, this, and this. You have to say so many Hail Marys. You have to say so many of these. And then you'll be forgiven. But there's something that you have to do. That's just embedded within kind of a Roman Catholic understanding. How about, you can tell my vision's not so great anymore, right? How about 25:20? Who's got that one?
Oh, that's me.
All right.
25:20 says, whoever sings songs to a heavy heart is like one who takes off a garment on a cold day and like vinegar on soda. That's awesome.
Comparative, right? You got that very clear like language. This is like that. Principle. That's more straightforward, I think.
Yeah.
What's the principle there?
Mourn with those who mourn.
That's right.
Weep with those who weep.
That's right. Which, again, there's a principle with that. Jackie said, mourn with those who mourn, weep with those who weep.
The example here is the opposite of that, right? It's those who aren't mourning with those who mourn.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. Be sensitive to people's emotional state. I mean, to me, that would be my takeaway principle.
That was in your class.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I taught a class on helping the hurting, and I think the first part of that was rejoicing with those who weep or something like that. Things generally not to do.
Rejoicing with those who weep.
But that's the proverb, right? Don't sing songs
And I love
to a
the
heavy
picture
heart.
of the science experiment volcano, the science fair volcano. Vinegar and soda,
Oh,
like
yeah,
they even back then.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. As you can see, I mean, we could spend all, this is why I knew we wouldn't get through a lot of the stuff on the Proverbs tonight, because this was going to take some time, but I wanted to spend some time doing this. Last one I'll do, this is one of my favorite Proverbs, actually. 27:14. Who's got that one?
That's also mine.
Okay, that's Dan's too. Love 27:14.
Man, I feel special. Let me see. Whoever blesses his neighbor with a loud voice. Why'd you give this to me, man? Whoever blesses his neighbor with a loud voice rising early in the morning will be counted as cursing. Oh, my son would love this one and be really glad you gave it to me. Amy's like, why do you go in his room like that? I'm like, Ephraim!
Time to get up.
And Amy's always like,
That's
what?
brutal.
Yeah.
It's vicious.
She's like, she goes in and rubs his back.
But here's the thing. Now, you got to get him up.
Yeah.
Right? So it's a question of how to get him up.
Yeah.
But the proverb is you're trying to speak some kind of blessing to your neighbor.
Yeah.
So what's the problem, though? What? Timing. So the principle is what? We said before, how you say something matters. The principle here is when. Timing matters.
Yeah.
Like, your intentions are good. You want to bless your neighbor. But if you bless your neighbor with a loud voice early in the morning, your neighbor's going to take that as a curse. What in the... What are you doing? That's just not going to be taken well, because wisdom considers timing. There's a time to have that conversation. There's a time not to have that conversation.
This is so practical.
So highly practical. So here's advice I've heard given recently by somebody that I respect as a counselor. Let me try to remember that. Halt BS. That's the whatever you call it. Yeah, halt BS. Do not have weighty conversations. They're hard. When you're hungry, when you're anxious or angry, when you're feeling lonely, when you're tired, when you're bored, or when you're stressed. There's a better time to have those conversations. Now, it may be that you didn't get rid of any of those things and the conversation has to be had. Okay, well, now self-control comes into play and all those kinds of things. But generally speaking, just refrain from hard, heavy conversations when you're feeling that way. 'Cause that may not go all that well.
Wait, hungry, angry, or anxious, lonely,
Tired,
Yes.
bored, or stressed.
Is this for the speaker or the recipient?
Probably both. That's a good question, Nina. Probably, I think the advice is given for someone not to initiate that conversation when they're feeling that way. But there's probably a time where you're going to be feeling a little bit more spiritually ready for that conversation. Yeah. Okay, well, if I didn't call on you, it's not personal. You can look at those proverbs up actually and think, okay, yeah, what is the principle here? But all of that was done, and I hope that was not a waste of instructional time here. But all of it was to really reinforce this idea here. The proverbs are offered in compressed form. So as we read that, they're compressed. Like, okay, so what does this mean? Where does it apply? What's the broader principle here? That's why we can't digest tons of them at one time, because prolonged reflection on the meaning and application of the Psalms is required. A couple last things and I'll stop. Notice that all the Proverbs we read, actually, they don't command. They just kind of make statements of the way life works. And they're mostly read as appeals. That accept these things as true of the way the world works, generally speaking. They invite, they appeal, they plead. You get this especially in the first 9 chapters of the book that we didn't get to much. We didn't get to deal with that much. So let me read a quote from Graham Goldsworthy again from his Gospel and Wisdom book. He wrote, "The wise men of Israel looked at what it meant to be in a disrupted order." Okay, so there's the reality of the fall. While not conforming to the disruption. The optimism of Proverbs is that chaos has not conquered, and that order can still be perceived. Moral order. God has not withdrawn all his creative cohesion from the universe. Everywhere in the world around us are evidences of God's maintenance of order if we would only see them. The book of Proverbs is pointing these things out. There is an order, and that order can be summarized in a kind of sowing, reaping principle. There's where the order is. What you sow, you will reap. Again, this anticipates Job a little bit, doesn't it? That is the exception. Did Job reap what he had sown? Well, his friends insisted that that must be what happened, because that's the way the world works. And Job was insistent that that's not what happened. I didn't commit. I'm not being punished for some sin that I committed. I don't know the reason. If I could have an audience with God and talk with him, I would be vindicated. I mean, that's Job's posture through most of the book. And his friends are like, well, you had to do something, Job. Because you're suffering like this, and that's the way the world works. So we'll get to some of that in a little bit. The truths of Proverbs, I'm probably not going to be able to touch on this very much. Proverbs 9, beautiful chapter. Maybe we'll just start with reading it next week, spend a little bit of time on it, and then move on to one of the second truths I want to talk about, which deals a little bit more with sowing and reaping. Proverbs 9, you get at the beginning of the chapter, Lady Wisdom is calling from the highest places in the town. Come in here, eat, find life. You get this kind of middle section. At the end of the chapter, Lady Folly is also calling from the highest places in the town and says almost the same thing. Come in here and eat. But it's not quite the same thing. There is a contrast, but there's 2 constant voices. And from the highest parts in the town, everybody's hearing them. That's where we live. We're surrounded with voices of wisdom and folly saying this is the way to live. This is how the world works. This is how you should live in light of that. And there's this question at the end. So this is the end of the first section of Proverbs, right? Chapter 9. At the end of that first section, there's this question of who are you going to listen to? Whose voice are you going to heed? And you can see in chapter 9, if you read it maybe between now and next week, who you listen to has enormous consequences. Just look at the end of the person who listens to wisdom and the end of the person who listens to folly. That's the contrast. It's a beautiful chapter. Wonderful chapter. But we won't spend a lot of time looking at that. We could spend a lot of time talking about what are the voices saying, because that would be worth exploring today. What do the voices of wisdom that are sounding out sound like? And how do they counter the words of Lady Folly today? What is she saying today? In distinct ways, in our time, in our place, in our culture, what does that sound like? Maybe something like,
Be all you can be.
that's right. You belong to yourself. I said this, I think, a couple weeks ago. Listen to your heart. It knows the way. That's Lady Folly talking. What's that? What's that?
Every day, in every way, I'm getting better and better.
So, there are voices that we have to discern, and that's what Proverbs 9 is about. We're out of time tonight. Probably we may spend all of week 4 in Proverbs as well. I do want to spend some time talking about the sowing and reaping. And then again, Job and Ecclesiastes we're going to look at as counters, well, let me not say it that way, qualifiers to what we read about in the book of Proverbs. And how are we to actually understand what those books are contributing to our understanding of wisdom? Okay? That's where we're headed. Great. I had a lot of fun with this tonight. I'm glad you're here tonight. Let me pray. Father in heaven, we do thank you for, again, our time together and time to contemplate wisdom. Would you help us to contemplate your wisdom at all times? That it would be, that we would bind it to our hands. That it would be a garland on our necks. That we would pursue it. That we would seek after it as something more precious than silver or gold. We confess that we're not faithful in doing that, and so would you propel us, motivate us, and prompt us by your Spirit to be a people who hunger and thirst for wisdom, because we know that ultimately all of the treasures of wisdom and knowledge are found in our Savior Jesus, and we want to hunger and thirst for him who satisfies our souls. So help us to do that, Lord. Be with us as we leave this place, and help us to live in such a way that reflects you.